Today, in the first episode of the Philosophy Society podcast, I talked to Matthew Nota. Matt has just finished his undergraduate degree in psychology and is now in the process of deciding on his future course of action. We discuss different ways of reading the Bible, the role of symbolism, and how these two affect meaning and truth. Matt has a general concern that our scientific worldview is reductive and therefore dismissive of some important lessons that we can learn from religious texts. We discuss why this is and what we may learn from a different reading of the Bible. It was a pleasure talking to Matt. He really is someone that enjoys exploring the big questions about life, reality, society, and the universe. Matthew Nota, are you a church goer?
No. Okay, so this is interesting. So, I never grew up going to church. I sort of gave it a go, I guess. In the last year, I started going to a Protestant church. But then I've stopped since the COVID stuff. But right now, just sort of in the last week, I've formed the intention of going back to church, but specifically going to Orthodox church.
Why?
So there's the way that the history of it worked is that there was the Orthodox church, and as it went on, that sort of split the schism into Orthodoxy and then the Catholic Church, right?
Yep.
And then that went on, and there was another split where the Catholic Church split off the Protestant Church.
Yep.
So it's like, as you go down, there's Orthodoxy, and then it branches off into Catholicism, branches off into Protestantism. Each split seems to be a deterioration in that it is... I'll extend the pattern further. So Protestantism split off into atheism in a sense, right?
Well,
because so it split off into there's the stuff like the what would you call it? Like Pentecostal, like the stuff that's even more open, right?
Your Lutherans and stuff.
Yeah, and then past that, I think atheism is in a sense the next step. So what I mean by that is that it's increasingly rational, right? Increasingly trying to rationalize what's going on. Yeah. But rationalizing spirituality doesn't work.
Yes. Well, that's hello. It's like I'm recording with 21st century Friedrich Nietzsche, who made the 20th century resound to his proclamation of the death of God. But his point there is, at least what I can gather, because it's an infinitely complex point, but his point there being that when you search for the truth, when you search for rationality, which in his genius is in saying that the church actually pushes for the truth, and the church in that way essentially killed itself, because when we're constantly searching for truth, it kind of undermines many of our fundamental beliefs, because we go, oh man, is this really going to be true in that sort of objective scientific sense?
Yeah. There's a pattern, right? I'm going to be coming back to the Bible a lot, because I've been reading it more and reading more analysis of it and better understanding the patterns, right? And I think everything, so there's the way that's structured is there's Genesis, and there's creation, and then there's the Garden of Eden and the fall, right? Everything after the Garden of Eden is recapitulating that same story at a larger scale. So what happens is man is created, and then there's a split, right? Man is split into two, right? Adam and Eve, right? And that split is also falling asleep. Man falls asleep and is split into two. And that's also death. So I better start with symbolism. I gotta start with this to explain what the hell I'm going on about. So in philosophy especially, and even in the modern day, we think a lot about strict identities, right? It either is or isn't identical to something. So when I say Adam falls asleep and Adam dies, those aren't identical, right? But there is a very strong association. So this sort of symbolic identity is not strict identity, it's association, right? And if, like, just to take a different angle, let's say you have an idea, right? And you have this idea and a certain pattern of neural activity happens in your brain, right? There's like, I don't know, let's say I'm thinking about this whiteboard over here, right? And there's all the parts of my brain associated with white, and associated with school, and associated with ideas, and associated with writing. All of that activates in a specific pattern. If I say the word whiteboard to you, that captures some aspect of that, but not all of it.
Some aspect of the whiteboard.
Of the idea in my head.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the idea in my head has a nearly infinitely complex web of associations, right? I can't give you that, right? So if I say whiteboard, and if I say that whiteboard, and you say that whiteboard, in philosophy we think of them as strictly identical, right? But when I say that whiteboard, and you say that whiteboard, we're thinking about different things, because the ideas in our head are not strictly the same.
Yeah, because we've had different experiences with whiteboard.
Yes.
Yeah, and different associations with whiteboard.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the way the symbolism works is that it's associative. So when Adam dies, when Adam falls asleep, when Adam gets split, all of these things are strongly associated together, right? And that means that every time sleep happens in the Bible, or in any story, right, it is always associated with death. It is always associated with a splitting apart. It is always associated with a falling. That's why we say fall asleep. These patterns are everywhere, right? There was one I was thinking of the other day. There's arise. Whenever God talks at the beginning of a section of the Bible, he talks to someone, he says arise, right? That means rise up, right? It means stand up, it means get up, it means wake up. Up. All of these are up, right? And to be up is to be upright, to be righteous, right? Upright and righteous. There's all of these ideas are associated together. And what they are is it's a calling to become higher, to become more aligned with God.
Do you reckon that the way that modern society treats language and treats ideas is reductive of that?
Yeah. Okay, so when I mentioned the pattern of the church, right? That's also the pattern of language. It's the pattern of everything, I guess. So language starts out simple, right? There's few words, but they're still pointing to the same world, right? And there's a lot of things even with the few words, right? So they might use the word sky water to refer to rain, right? They use the words in the way that they can. Over time, it gets increasingly differentiated, right? It separates, right? It increases in multiplicity. That's also what happens in like the Bible, right? It starts out really simple, right? God, heaven, earth, blah, 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 blah. And then as it goes along, it increasingly separates and differentiates. The language becomes more complex and is able to articulate more precise different ideas. Our language as a whole is like that. We've got so many precise words now that we can very specifically articulate this tiny little specific thing to someone. But the problem is that there are words, when you have a word for, let's say we've got a word for every single type of whiteboard, 100 years in the future, I point at that and I say whiteboard. That's not a word anymore. There's it's like a technotron or whatever. I don't know. I can't point to whiteboards as a concept anymore because we split that concept up into these sub-concepts, right? If I point at that chair, right, I say that's a chair. If I tell you there's a chair in the room, you're going to think of chairs in general. You're not going to think of a chair that looks like that, right?
Yeah.
If I say that's a plastic deck chair, whatever you call that.
It's like I don't look at a t-shirt anymore and go, there's clothing. I look at it and go, there's a t-shirt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is that there's an advantage to that, right? which is like with philosophy. Philosophy is so specific. You have to clearly define and like very precisely articulate things. The advantage is that you can like hone in and very precisely cover something. The disadvantage is that the more it's like a microscope, right? You can see one thing really clearly, but you can't see anything else. That's the issue.
Well, and you reckon the way that we're using language, and correct me if I'm wrong, the way that we're using language in modern society is honing in on single things and missing the bigger picture.
Yeah, missing the forest for the trees.
Yeah, okay. And
Yeah.
do you reckon, like let's take that, specify it to, like, religion or spirituality.
Yes.
Is that undermining our religion and our spirituality?
Yes, but also it's part of the pattern, right? It's like because the pattern of the fall, it's also the pattern of every story, right? It's like there's a person, there's the call to adventure, whatever, at the beginning, and the hero becomes aware of the thing which is outside, right? It's like you mentioned that you haven't seen many movies.
I haven't even watched The Lion King, so it's about this point where everyone turns the podcast off.
So in Star Wars, in the original Star Wars movie, right?
Yeah.
Luke's at home and he's got this sort of stable space where he's at, where he's like just working, plodding along. He's got a future laid out for him. Then what happens is there's two things that sort of come from outside. There's a message from the princess, right? There's this princess who is in need of help, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is the Empire, the evil invading force comes. So his world is turned on its head, right? It's flipped upside down because what was once a stable space is changed because there is something outside of that space that comes in, right? Which is the possibility of the princess, right? The princess represents the possibility of like a relationship, of love, of marriage, of kids, and the destructive possibility of the Empire. And they come in and they destroy his home, right? This is the eternal pattern. This is the Garden of Eden story. This is also science, right? Science, we make a theory, and then we fit a theory to the facts, and then we find new facts that that conflict with the theory, right? Either there's something like the beautiful princess, right, that isn't covered by our theory, but we want it to, or there's the evil emperor, which destroys our theory because it's an anomaly which it breaks down the theory, right? There's two types of anomaly. So there's the anomaly outside, and because of that, we have to produce a new theory. We have to go out and extend. We have to go into the unknown territory and extend the theory. We have to create a new theory which covers all of that. So this is part of the pattern, right? In that, in our increasing differentiation, right? That's potential. We have the potential to use the microscope and to zoom in on the world. We don't know how to use that. Like, we need to find a way to cover that with spirituality. Does that make any sense?
So what I'm getting is a couple of things here. The first thing I would say is that, to me, there's there's multiple ways of looking at the world, right? And
yes.
And lots of philosophers have touched on that point. So Heidegger, for example, talks about ways of revealing, and that's, in some relevant sense, connected to ways that we can perceive the world. So, the example that I've thought is best to understand that is if I get a letter in the mail,
Yep.
right, and that letter is going to tell me whether I did or did not get into a university, say.
Yep.
There's a couple of ways of looking at that letter. You can look at that letter like, here's a piece of paper in an envelope.
Yes.
Right? Or you can look at that letter like, here's my future.
Yes.
What I'm hearing from you right now is the scientific worldview is one way of looking at the world, and it's really, really good for looking at specific things in lots of detail.
Yep. You can see the letter in the envelope.
We've got a spiritual way of looking at the world, which we need to encapsulate a broader conception of the world.
Yeah. If you look at the piece of paper in the envelope, right?
Yeah.
And you forget that it's a piece of paper in an envelope, right? That there's some slight problems that may cause in some circumstances, but it's way worse if you look at that piece of paper and you forget that it's your future, right? So the meaning takes precedent over the specific facts, and this is like the symbolism of that is like it's consistent, right? It's the way that that's symbolized, one in the Bible, but also just in mythology, is heaven and earth. And it's also the higher and the lower, right? So there's the intangible and the tangible, right? There is the patterns and the specifics, right? So the letter, right? That is a specific object, but it also is part of a pattern. It's part of, like, there's an intangible reality to it. It's the meaning of it, right? That is the heaven, the heavenly component of it, the spiritual component of it. And then there is the physical aspect of it, which is the paper and stuff. And that's the higher aspect of it and the lower aspect of it. And that pattern is consistent. It's the higher it's represented by the sky, it's represented by the birds, the stars, the sun, the moon, things that are above us, things that seem intangible or that like are intangible, things that are smaller, right? A seed represents heaven because it's a small thing that also represents the pattern of the life form, right? It becomes the whole plant. It's the small thing that becomes the whole plant. But then there's the earth, which is like it's bigger, it's lower, and it is the physical part of things. And all of mythology, but the Bible in particular as well, tells us this. Because this is what science is trying to do, right? Is we're trying to zoom in with the microscope and we're trying to understand the way that the world is built from the ground up. And if you understand gravity, if you understand the
fundamental building
Newton's
blocks
laws
of
of motion,
yeah.
that's useful, but you can't just take that and use it in your life. For your life, right? The way to conceive of it is as a whole. So like, if you go and you want to throw a baseball, right? And someone tells you, oh, that's easy, just go study the laws of Newton's laws of motion, plot out the trajectory that you want, calculate the required speed. That's ridiculous, right? You can't take
It might help me throw a
components.
baseball.
You can't take the components and stack them up. You have to take the whole thing as one whole, right? And the whole thing is a whole. Like, our entire experience, all of reality, you can consider that as one whole, right? But then you can divide it up. So, at the beginning of the Bible, it tries to lay out the pattern, right? And the pattern is that there is one thing that encompasses the whole of reality. It is the pattern of reality, the past, the future, all of eternity, right? And that's God. And then from God emerges the heaven and the earth. The first distinction to be made after all of reality is the intangible and the tangible, the pattern, the meaning, and the physical, the heaven and the earth. That's like the fundamental distinction to be made.
Okay, so I've got like maybe 17 to 20 different things to say now.
Yeah. Shoot.
And I'm thinking, what's the best way to navigate through this? So, I'll say 3 main points.
Yes.
And I'm just interested to hear your answers. We'll take them one by one. So, firstly, if I'm throwing a baseball, to go back to that example, I get you. You can't just learn the laws of motion and human biology and stuff like that. But say I'm bowling a ball in cricket.
Yes.
Because I'm a cricketer, unfortunately. Say I'm bowling a ball in cricket.
Yeah.
I need to think about the entire delivery.
Yes.
Like it's one thing, and when I'm running in, I'm not thinking about the fact that not only is my foot pressing on the earth, but the earth is pressing on my foot, Newton's third law of motion.
Yeah.
But it does get to a point where when you're working on things, it's like, okay, what you need to do is you need to cock your wrists in this specific way. You need to zoom in and fix things. So my first point about what you've just said is there not some benefit that we can get from zooming in and then going to the bigger picture?
Yes.
And is that specific to baseball and cricket?
No, it's everything.
Or can we do that with the Bible?
So the question you asked before was, is the zooming in, the microscope, the science, does that undermine spirituality? And the answer is sort of yes and no, because at the moment, like when you start to focus on one element of your throw in cricket, right, for a little bit, you get worse, right? Because you have to focus on that bit. That's the fall. That is, you're going out of the garden. You see the princess. The princess is, I could have a better pitch, right? And you have to go and you have to venture over there. So it's going to get worse before it gets better. But then there is the possibility of that being covered by the hole. So once you've worked on your pitch, you've worked on your wrist motion, right? Then when it comes to the big game, you don't want to be thinking about that.
Yeah. You
want to return to the hole.
So
that's it.
Like, in that relevant sense, then we might be able to say, if what you're saying is correct, that we've started with the whole, thousands of years ago when Christian religion was born, we had the whole, and then with this Enlightenment thinking and this focus on science, we narrowed down into the specifics.
Yes.
And most of the time, I've always looked at that like, well, religion's screwed now. But with what you're saying, it might be the case that, well, now that we've looked at the specifics, we might be able to extract back out to the whole again.
Yeah.
Understand religion on a deeper level. With things like evolutionary biology, with things like neuroscience, with psychological understanding, with that narrow stuff, we might be able to extract out now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's obviously an infinitely complex task.
Well, yeah. The evolutionary biology is an interesting one. I feel like this is going on to a different point, but I feel like we've wrapped up recently though. Well, so something I've been thinking of lately, because the hardest part for me to reconcile for myself with God, with the idea of God, is that, like, why is it a person? Like, why is God a he rather than an it? Because, like, I feel like I've explained this before, like the totality, right? Like, God is everything. God is the pattern of the universe, right? Why would that be a he rather than an it? That was always, like why? Like, it doesn't make sense. It makes sense to me now. So, when you look at things, like, when you zoom in with the microscope, right? And you look at the pieces of the puzzle, they look like they're things adhering to laws, right? Like, adhering to the laws of physics, right? Like, atoms moving and, like, electromagnetic forces and whatnot, right? They're, like, perfectly regular. As you go up, right? Up the levels of complexity, right? From atoms to molecules to cells to trees to people, right? It gets increasingly more complex. As it gets more complex, it shifts from that sort of perfect law-like following to becoming more and more like a person. And intuitively, we are prepared to... We've got the intuitive hardware to deal with people, to understand people, right? So, like, with evolution, the way that we think of it is... The way that it actually works is that there's, like, specific forces, right? There is the species die out.
Yep.
And then the species will reproduce and they will randomly recombine the traits, and then the ones with the traits that are better suited to
that selection
the
pressure
environment will, like, over time, will gradually become more and more prominent, right? there's a much easier way to think of it, which is that nature selects. Nature, this impersonal thing, has this personal quality of looking at the things that are suited and the things that aren't suited and choosing, right? And if we think of it like that, like when you think of, why do we have this trait, right? It's adaptive. We have it because it's adaptive. And natural selection wants to give us adaptive traits. That's a really simple way to think of it. It's a super complex thing because you have to lay out every step of that process to understand it from the ground up. But intuitively to understand it, you just say, yeah, nature selects. Nature wants us to have adaptive traits. That's the personal level of analysis is a trick of our mind to handle that which is more complex. So when we talk about God, we talk about the totality of everything, right? We think of it as it wants us to be happy or whatever. Like, it wants us to succeed. It wants us to do this and that. Rather than saying that God, like, follows laws. Does that make sense?
The thing that I'm going to question you on is your understanding of what God is. Because that's obviously very tricky. And you're saying that God is the totality, but there would be different interpretations of God in everywhere, like almost everyone. And I don't know if the interpretation of God as the totality, firstly, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that.
Okay,
and
I'll try
secondly,
and lay
I'm
that
not
out.
sure if that's what other... Because what I see a lot is someone goes, okay, God is X,
Yeah.
and then they create some proof that X exists, and then they give it to someone else, and someone's like, oh, God exists, but then they attach a different meaning to that term, God.
Yeah. It's, what's it? Equivocation.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. No, for sure. So I'll take it from a few different angles to see if I can make it clear. So
Hit me.
with the heaven and earth thing, right? It's layers. So as it goes up in layers, there are fewer things. And as it goes down in layers, there's more things. So that is a chair, right? There's 100 different types of chair, right? Then all of those chairs are united in this sort of abstract, intangible relationship, right? There's this one thing that links them all, which is the fact that they're chairs, right? Okay, you say chairs and you say tables and you say desks, right? All of those are linked by this other abstract thing, which is furniture, right? You keep going up, and there is one thing at the top, right? One hypothetical thing at the top which links everything together, right? It is a pattern, and it's like the pattern of patterns, right? It is the highest of the high, the most high thing, right? That's what God is, and like all of the
But where do you get that
all of
from?
the imagery, like, so
Can I try here for a second?
Yeah.
So I'm all with you,
yeah,
and you go, there might be like some ultimate pattern, like
Yes.
the highest level pattern.
yes.
And my question is, why do we have to call that God? Why can't
What
we
else
just
are we gonna call it?
the highest level pattern? We could just
In the
say,
Bible, they refer to God as the Most High. The Most High, they refer to him with all sorts of things, right? The Lord, it's the thing above. What they're talking about is the thing above. And then, what's it? In Exodus, Moses goes up the mountain and God tells Moses his name. And the name is Yahweh, which is like, I am what I am. Like, I am what exists. That's what I am. That's what God is. That's the thing that trips us up, is that there's weird, like, perversions of what God is. Like in The Simpsons, my conception of God was informed by The Simpsons. When Homer sees God and it's a big beardy man in the sky, that's not what it is.
okay, so
that's missing the point.
If God is meant to be this pattern,
Yes.
why do we then get all these personifications of God? So, like...
Well, that is explain part of the personification thing.
So, like, a pattern is a pattern,
Yes.
right? Like, that's something that's intangible. That's something that's, like, hard to grasp. Like, I can go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and I can go, look, there's a pattern.
Yes.
But I can't be like, grab the pattern.
Yeah.
Right? And I certainly can't say that pattern's got a beard and took the rib of Adam and made it into Eve.
Yeah, well, the beard thing was never in the Bible. Like, there's a commandment about making graven image. You're not supposed to make images of God, because God is unimageable. Even the name, they weren't supposed to say God's name. That's because he is unfathomable. The name, it points to God, but it's not God. They made a really big point of that.
So why are we personifying God then? Because like you talk to 99% of people and you say
this is
God,
Protestantism.
Yeah, so they're not gonna
not to offend any Protestants out there.
Oh, I'm sure we're gonna offend everyone, but
yes,
I'm not concerned about that. We have everyone's got this image of God as a person,
as the beardy man in the sky.
Why do we have that image? B, do we have to have that image? And C, is it going to work if we just think about it as a pattern?
Yeah, okay, cool. So there's something else to say about symbolism, right? So in a story, like let's say in a story there's a big battle, right? How does the story tell you that the battle's over? Does a character just say, the battle finished, we won?
I doubt it, yeah.
They use symbolism, right? They give you the feeling that the battle has been won. And they do that by getting all of these patterns, all of these things associated with it. These carriers of the pattern of victory, right? And put all of them together, right? So the army falls. Maybe they don't even die, they just fall. That would tell you that they've won. Even though they all sit down. It's like, that tells you that the other army won, right? The sun rises. There's rain, there's dark clouds. All of that stops. The sun rises. That tells you the good guys won. You know the good guys won because the sun rose, right? You know the good guys won because they take off their helmets and they're hugging each other. All of these are symbols that the battle is over. None of these individually you look at the sun rising, that doesn't mean victory of a battle, does it? But all of these things taken together, they all point to that idea which unites those things. God is referred to as the Father, right? That's one of the ways, not the only way. He's the Father, He's the Lord, He is Yahweh, right? He's all of these things.
The Lamb, yeah.
Yeah. All of these are pointing, right? There is the thing that all of these things point to. That is God. God is not any of the... You don't confuse the finger that points with what it's pointing to. So the confusion comes from the use of the word Father. Because you think of father and you think of old beardy man, right? And the reason why you think of that is because like it makes sense to think of God as like that person, right? That does point at God. But it points at God. It isn't God. God doesn't look like that because God doesn't look like anything. God looks like everything, actually. But like, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, what I'm hearing from you is
it's pointing.
It would be the equivalent of
cover it.
Saying that a winning of the war is the sun rising.
Yeah.
And then everyone associates winning the war with the sun
100
rising.
years later, you see the sun rising, and you go, "Oh, we just won a war."
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah, it has to all go together.
Yeah.
Is there some use to the personification of God though? Because we might have done that with God, but why have we done that with God and not the war? Right? So we might now think of God as the Father.
Yes.
Why do we think of God as when we think of God we always think of the Father? But why don't we think of winning the war as the rising of the sun, or the winning of the war as the taking off of the helmet?
I think it's just not understanding. So, if we don't understand that, part of it's the materialist worldview, right? Because the Protestants are doing it too. You look at the Bible and you go, well, it says the Father, so He's a father, right? That's part of it. But then you see, the Renaissance paintings, and the painting of the creation of Adam is the big one, right? When God looks like Zeus. When God doesn't... Yeah. So I think the thing is that we have this arrogance where we look at those in the past and we look at the Bible and we go, oh, they said the Father and there's this picture of God like this, of God looking like Zeus, right? They must have thought that there was someone that looked like this in the sky. Maybe they had a vision where they saw this in the sky, right? And they went, oh, I think that's what's up there. Sounds reasonable. We have this arrogance to think that the people who came before us were, like, had no sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's, I think the arrogance is a big part of it, as well as just, like, I don't know, like, the world changes, and the Bible is designed, each part of it was written at a different time, for the people of that time, and they wrote it, it was written to be as eternal as possible, but, like, you go back and you read the stuff with Abraham and the stuff with Moses, and it's so far removed from the world we live in. Talking about tilling the soil, and, like, they make the sacrifices, and it's like, that was just part of the world they lived in. We don't sacrifice lambs anymore. It's alien to us. So we can't appreciate it in the way that it was written.
I guess what's important then is, if you're going to read the Bible
Yes.
in a non-scientific, non-literal, pattern-seeking, symbolic interpretation sort of way.
Yes.
I haven't read much of the Bible. If you're reading the Bible, what have you learned reading it that sort of way? That's what I'm interested in.
I'll start with, I'm going to pull out Genesis. I'm going to pull out the creation event, because that...
Just so everyone knows, Matthew Nota is about to open the Bible on his phone. I like it.
I forgot we were recording this.
That's good.
Cool. So in the beginning, right, at the start, at the first thing, right, it's the top, right? God created the heavens and the earth. So there's God, and there's the heaven, and there's the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep. So there's the heaven and the earth. The earth has no shape. This is the important stuff. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. So spirit is heaven, right? Spirit it means breath. It's the air. So the heavenly part of God is there, and then there's the waters, which is the earth, right? So, like, there's only heaven and earth at this stage.
Yeah.
So the Spirit is God, and the water is earth.
Yeah.
They're associated. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So there wasn't light before this. Before this, it was darkness. So what we've got so far is God, heaven, earth, Spirit, water, darkness, and light. Those are, like, the elements so far. Cool. Then God said, "Let there be a firmament." God made the sky, right? Put that between the waters. So the sky is there too. This is, like, laying out the fundamental parts of our reality. So,
in a literal sense?
Literal if you understand what the words mean. So, like, heaven is the intangible part of stuff. The first things, God created the intangible and the tangible. The patterns and the physical. Those are the two fundamental components of the world. Like, the first split, right? The first division. Because that's how we see the world, is we have to categorize. We have to separate it to understand it. To encounter the world, you have to categorize it into the ways that it should be categorized. So, it went from God, and then split everything into heaven, the intangible, and earth, the tangible, right? And then you're doing another split between light and dark, right? Which is, light is when the heaven and the earth are together, right? And that's when God speaks, right? The speaking truth is that. To speak truth is to unite heaven and earth, because the intangible part of what you're speaking is the meaning, and the tangible part is what you're talking about. So if the intangible, like what I'm saying, and the tangible, what's actually going on in the world, if they match, that is the truth. If the intangible part of it doesn't match, so if I say there's not a table there, right? The intangible part of my speech doesn't match the world. That is false. That is a lie. And there's darkness and confusion. Darkness is ambiguity, right? That is what happens. If everybody's lying, the world is plunged into darkness because everybody is confused. It's all ambiguous, right? Light is when you can see clearly. Light is when it's not confused, when it is clear. When I say there is a table there and I'm telling the truth. When everyone's telling the truth, the world is full of light because there is clarity.
So, like, what I'm hearing so much here is a lot of interpretation.
To remove some of the ambiguity from the interpretation, right? These are the fundamental patterns, right?
Yeah.
Light, dark, heaven, earth, God. Those are the main ones. That applies to everything. When I'm looking at something else, right? Like a later part of the Bible, like whenever there's birds, like the birds are like it's a white bird or a black bird, right? The white bird is associated with light because it's white, and associated with heaven because it's a bird, not a snake, right? Not a beast. What it's trying to point at, it's trying to symbolize heaven and it's trying to symbolize light. And there's a black bird, it's trying to symbolize heaven and the dark. The whole rest of the Bible is using these terms, and it always calls back to these basic terms. The way that you can tell, the terms are laid out in the beginning, and then it refers back to them. And the patterns of associations with the terms are consistent. Like, when there's a white bird, right, that means that there is heaven and there is light, right? That means that there is an intangible reality, right? A meaning, a truth, wisdom, whatever. And it's true, right? It's genuine. It is shining on the world, right? If it's a blackbird, then it is, again, an intangible truth or an intangible thing, right? But it is dark. We can't tell what it is. So, like, if in any movie, right, if you see a black bird, it's an ominous sign, right? It is a sign of chaos, a sign of the potential ambiguity and destruction, right? If you see a white bird, it is a sign of light, of understanding.
So, here's a question.
The consistency is what makes it not just me reading into it.
The thing is that there would be people that would interpret the Bible using a similar framework to what you've used.
Yes.
So using the framework of, I'm going to look at this as trying to find patterns and I'm going to connect these key terms.
Yes.
But they would still interpret it and draw a different lesson out of it.
Yes.
So my question is,
how is it fail-safe against wrong interpretations?
Well, how is it that you've got one interpretation and someone else has got a different interpretation, and how do we compare those interpretations and which one of them is correct?
Yeah. So the thing is that, like, because symbolism is in some sense more vague, in some sense it's not, but like, because it is not as precise, right? This is something else just came to me, but because the symbols are not precise, they can be interpreted obviously in multiple ways. There's multiple angles at which to interpret them. But there's also got to be definitively wrong interpretations for them. If there's not, then it's hopeless, right? So the white bird, right, is like, it's associated with God because it's light and it's heaven, right? So when God enters the picture, there should be white birds, right? There shouldn't be black snakes, and there never are. Black snakes are not a sign of God. Black snakes do not connect to God. It's the reverse, right? So you can tell that the pattern's there because the opposite pattern is never there.
So what I'm interested in now, and this is slightly changing tacks.
Yeah.
So if you want to go back, let me know. But what I'm hearing from you is almost like you're almost taking a metaphysics from the Bible, almost as in reality can be broken down into tangible and intangible, and the tangible can be broken down into these sorts of ways. And that actually is a metaphysics. Right? Now, this is where I think we would differ, because if I'm, and this has changed for me in the last probably 6 months or so, but now when I come across religious ideas, spiritual ideas, I'm not actually like you, I don't want to read it literally.
Yeah.
But I don't even want to read it for something that's true at all, right? So I'm not going to take a metaphysic that I think would be true out of the Bible. I'm going to take a lesson or a morality or an ethic or something that, like, I don't actually care if it's true in some sort of metaphysical way. What I'm actually interested in is whether it's useful for me to believe that particular thing.
Why?
Why? Because...
What's the source of usefulness? Like, what useful for what?
Like, useful for navigating through the world.
Where are you going?
That's
what spirituality is there for.
To a better world and a better life.
Better how?
Well, see, that's a complex idea.
Yeah. For sure.
But I don't think...
This is one of the... If I read the Bible, right? And, like, it's a work in progress, right? It's a lifetime thing, right? If I read the Bible and I have to take it as just like, well, the Bible says this, so it's true, then I don't want to do that. If I'm reading it in the expectation that it will prove itself, the combination of the Bible and the world, it will prove itself. And so far that's what I'm seeing, but I'm still working at it. The Garden of Eden thing points out what happens, like the start of humanity, right, is that we are created, or we exist, we come into existence, right, and then there's the tree with the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, right, and eating that fruit is acquiring the knowledge of good and evil, and that's where the problem starts, right? As soon as you know what's good and what's evil, that's the beginning of the problems.
So let me try to specify what I said before.
Yeah.
We'll see if we can bring it in here.
Yeah. Yeah, I
think we've agreed that when the Bible says, and on the third, I don't know what the Bible says at the start, because I haven't read it for yonks.
Yeah.
But when it says, on the third day, God created light, I think we are both agreeing that God literally didn't invent electromagnetic radiation on the third day.
No.
And we want to say, like, we shouldn't read it as literally true, but what I'm seeing from
literally true from our, like, microscope version of the truth.
Yeah.
We have a microscope view of light.
Yeah, okay.
They didn't.
So you want to extract out to the pattern, but you still want to see if that pattern is true or false. That pattern can still be the correct pattern or the incorrect pattern.
So,
that pattern can correspond to reality.
Okay. So, 3,000 years ago, right? The creation story in Genesis, it didn't matter to them, looking at it, whether it actually happened in 6 days or not. To us, it matters whether it happened in 6 days or not, because we have evidence saying this didn't actually happen in 6 days, right?
Yep.
So, the default move, I think, at least for atheists reading the Bible, is to look at it and go, it's wrong. It's just, they were idiots. It's wrong, right? They just didn't know, right? The next move, a different move, is to look at it and go, okay, what were they actually trying to say by a day, right? Because, like, a day is dark and then light, right? And what that is there's ambiguity, right? Because that's what darkness is. Darkness is, like, one of the most fundamental... Like, that's what darkness symbolizes. Yeah. When you see darkness in a movie, when it's dark for a scene, it symbolizes ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
Tension. It could go either way. When there's a light, that symbolizes fixedness. Like, it is... Like, they won. The victory has happened. The battle is in flux. It's dark, right? It's raining. There's clouds everywhere. Ambiguity, chaos, tension. When the battle is won, the light comes up, the clouds part, the sun is shining, right? There's a rainbow. the one day in creation, right? In the 6 days of creation, each day follows the same pattern of there is this sort of ambiguity, and then God says, no, now it's like this. Let there be light. There's now light, right? That's the first day. Then God says, let there be this, right? He is defining the world. He is separating, categorizing the world. And in doing that, it is going from a night to a day. Symbolically, it is going from dark to light. It doesn't matter if it actually happened in 6 of our days. What matters is that there was a stage of dark and then a stage of light. And that definitely, like, looking at that pattern, right? There is dark and then there is light at the next stage down, because it is increasingly defined.
Lots to think about there.
Yes.
Man. My final question that I'm going to ask you is, say I want to read the Bible. There's lots of ways to read it. There's lots of ways to interpret it. How do you go about it?
If you're reading it and okay, it's the same as that pattern, right? The pattern of science, right? You have the theory, and then there's the anomalies, and then you extend the theory, you change the theory to cover the anomalies, right? That's the pattern of knowledge. The pattern of understanding anything, right, is when something doesn't fit the theory, you have to go and you have to face that, right? And then you have to try and create a new theory which covers it, right? If your understanding of the Bible and of the world's part of it too. Science is part of it too. Now, science is obviously flawed. Like, it's imperfect, right? Any scientific finding, like, there has to be, you can't just take one study and go, oh, science discovered this, right?
Yeah.
Because it's got to be backed up, right? If the finding in science, like a well-supported scientific finding conflicts with something in the Bible, then it's like, okay, you've got to change you've got to come up with a new theory, right? And if at the end of it, you read the Bible and all of it and you go, it's just wrong, then I don't know what to tell you. Maybe it is just wrong. But the assumption that you understand what meaning was trying to be conveyed by day and by night, right? The first day and the first night. That should be one of the first assumptions to test. You should be going, hang on, maybe when they say day and night, they're not saying day and night in the way that I understand it. Maybe they're pointing at something different. So, humility, obviously, is essential. But also people, have read through, and I'm not the first person to think about it in this way.
Yeah.
People, there's the church fathers, right, have written books about, this interpretation, right? And, I'm still getting there.
Yeah.
But currently, Jonathan and Matthew Pageau are people to look up in terms of, this is what informed my interpretation. They can be wrong, right? And if I take their interpretation and apply it to the Bible and go, hang on, there's holes, there are anomalies, right? What do? I try and find ways of understanding it that don't assume that people in the past were idiots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Man, there is a lot. There is a lot for me to think about.
There's a lot, yeah.
But
there's a lot there.
Thanks for having this conversation, and
thank you.
Maybe one day I'll think about it enough to have you back on and we'll continue where we left off.
Maybe.
Thanks, mate.
Oh, brilliant.